When I started thinking about writing a biography of Gerrit Smith, the question came up in my mind immediately, why bother? I knew there were other biographies of him available. So I had heard two different people say in public meetings that somebody should do a new biography of Gerrit Smith. Both of those folks I respected highly. One of them was Dorothy Wilsey, who happens to be now my wife. She wasn't at the time, but she was deeply into Peterborough history even then and made that comment. The other was Milton Cernett. He's a Syracuse University professor of African American history, now retired. So I heard these comments and sort of wondered, why are people who really know something about this issue saying that? So I collected the three biographies that already existed. One was written in 1878, actually published in 1878, 4 years after Gerrit Smith died. He died on December 28, 1874, so it was really just about 3 years later. It was commissioned by the family, and that was not unusual at the time for the family to commission a friend to write a biography. And when it came out, it was well received, sold well, and was a very highly complimentary book about this noble man that did so much good. Now, hold that thought in mind. The second biography was also published by a family friend who had, at a time, lived in Peterborough, and was published in 1900. And it also was a eulogy of this wonderful person that did so much with his money. Smith was, as you probably know, very, very rich. In our terms today, he was a multi-billionaire. And he didn't want the money for himself. So he gave away most of it. Very interesting attitude. But the second biography was also highly complimentary, and they're both correct. It's certainly okay to talk about the wonderful, noble, philanthropic things that Gerrit Smith did throughout his life. He helped a lot of people. The third one came out in 1939, and research for it was done throughout the 1930s by a man who was at that time the chairman of the history department at Syracuse University. The papers of the Gerrit Smith life had been turned over to Syracuse University in 1928 by his grandson, who lived at the Mansion House in Peterborough. So he turned over the papers, and they're huge volumes of them. There are almost 50,000 letters, 55 boxes of stuff, of course all handwritten, and much of the penmanship is terrible. I put a couple of examples of Gerrit's penmanship in the book just to challenge you. It's frustrating to try and read it, but it took me a long while, but I did develop the capability of reading the stuff. And they were transferred to Syracuse University in 1928, and the house burned in 1936. So it was sort of just in time that they got all of that rich historical trove of stuff out of the house and into the library, because it's still there. The third biography, the man's name was Ralph Harlow, who wrote it, and it came out to be a very highly critical, cynical, kind of a sarcastic treatment of this foolish old man that wasted so much money. Well, you get the drift of what I'm saying here? People looked at his extremes, see? You could write about all of the wonderful things he did, or you could write about the foolish, wasteful things he did, and he did both. So these biographies are not erroneous. They're just limited and probably somewhat unfair to the person because they only covered the extremes. And one of the things that Smith said before he died was, this is a quote, "I hope no one ever writes my life." And he knew what would happen. He knew that they would see his extremes and write about them, because that's what made news. You know, the dumb things you do and the really smart things you do end up in the newspaper. And all of the rest of what he did throughout his life, which really characterized the man in total, it wasn't written about as much in those books as he would have liked. So what I've tried to do with this one was be a little bit more fair and cover all of both the extremes and in between to give a fair treatment of his entire life. One of the things that people, let me give you an example. One of the things that people tend to know about Gerrit Smith, I frequently say when I give speeches, what do you know about Gerrit Smith? And immediately comes up, well, he was very rich. He was an abolitionist. And somebody will say, wasn't he psychologically unstable? Or as I put it, wasn't he nuts? He spent about 7 weeks at what we now call Marcy, after the John Brown raid. And this is what people remember him for. And it made a lot of news at the time because he was a nationally known figure. But is it fair to remember him for something that happened once in his life for a little over a month? You know, you think back about your own life or other people you know, and would you like to be remembered for something that characterized you once a long while ago but never again? Somewhat of an absurdity. But he did have a little trouble right there with actually a decade's worth of psychological pressures that mounted and mounted and mounted and mounted and mounted on him. Pressure, stress. And by the end of the decade in the 1850s, he was ready to pop. And what happened with the John Brown raid was that was just the last straw. And he lost contact for, actually he was in the hospital for only 4 weeks. And he came back home and went to work. So it had never, he was 62 years old. It had never happened before, and it never happened again. And the trouble is, people remember that about him. Well, there's a lot to remember about him, and that's what I tried to do here is go over it all. The book is arranged in 3 parts. The first part deals with his personal life. Relationships with his family and friends in the village of Peterborough, his children, his wife. The second part of the book deals with the master themes in his life: business, religion, and politics. And the third part deals with the important reform movements that he was influential in and known for. Of course, abolition. There's 2 or 3 chapters on abolition there. And temperance. He spent a lot of money and time on temperance. That's where the criticism comes. You know temperance isn't going to work. We tried it. Prohibition. You look back from our perspective today and you can say, well, don't waste your time there. But he didn't know that. People in the 1800s didn't know that. They thought they could do something about it morally, but it didn't work. So that was one of the things he was involved in. And women's rights. The 3 big social movements that he became involved in and infused with a lot of money to try and oil the wheels of change there. In the first part of the book, very quickly, he had relationships with his children that sort of reflected his own life with his parents. Anne Smith, it was actually his second wife. His first wife died 7 months after they were married. It was his college sweetheart. He graduated from Hamilton College in Clinton in 1818 and married his college sweetheart, who was the daughter of the president of the college. And she died 7 months later of what we would know of as encephalitis, fluid on the brain, and people didn't know what to do about it, and she died. About 3 years later, he remarried a woman named Anne Carroll Fitzhugh from a Maryland slave-holding family. How about that for an abolitionist? So it mixes things together interestingly, doesn't it? Her family had actually decided to get out of slavery before they were married, and had done so. They sold their slaves south and moved from Maryland to what is now the Rochester area, and were influential in establishing the city of Rochester. But they, together, Anne and Gerrit had 7 children. 2 of them lived to adulthood. Tragic, isn't it? It was a tough time to stay alive, especially for kids.